everybody, welcome to the Knitted Kitchen Blog Hub. I'm Pia from Stitches and Scraps, and today we're working on square number 11, which is the Mitered Garter Stitch Square. This is one of those squares that's easier to understand if you look at the big picture first and kind of have an idea what you're doing. And I didn't make a chart for this one because it's honestly just harder to chart because there's not an easy way to show the repeats because we're going to be working from corner to corner at an angle. So I thought I would just walk you through the idea of the square before we start. So here I have a square. We're going to pretend this is our square. Okay. The way the mitered square works is that you're going to be casting on these stitches here. You're going to put a stitch marker right here, okay? And then you're going to cast on these stitches here. So this whole edge on the left side and the bottom side, that's your cast on edge. Now, this stitch marker as we go along is going to move towards this corner, okay? So that's the stitch marker. Every row we're going to be proceeding towards that corner, and I know my line's a little wiggly, but that's okay. So when we work our rows, what we're going to do is we're going to work from one end up to where the stitch marker is, right up to here. We're going to do a little decrease here, okay? We're going to do a decrease here. That brings it in around that corner, and then we work back up this way. So we're working from a very long cast on edge, and we're steadily decreasing until we get to nothing, and then we bind off. That's the basics of it, and we could do the whole thing in garter stitch, would be really easy. But if you look at any of my previous squares, they all have a seed stitch border like this one. This was the garter chevron square, and you can see it's got the seed stitch border. I want my squares to look the same, so I want to put a seed stitch border on this one as well. So the first 5 rows here, I'm actually going to do seed stitch. So this section here will all be seed stitch, and this section here will all be seed stitch. That's the first 5 rows. That takes care of these 2 borders. But now I want to do seed stitch on these 2 borders also. So as I do each row, the first few stitches are going to be seed stitch, and then the rest of this will be garter up to here where the last few stitches are going to be seed stitch. So all of our rows will begin and end with seed stitch like that, giving us this side of the border and this side of the border, and then the rest of the rows will be just garter stitch, so we get those garter stitch lines as we go around. We're only going to be decreasing on the right side rows, so this is going to be nice and easy, and this is approximately what your square is going to look like when you're done. One more thing I want to mention to you before we get started is the cast on and the bind off. In my previous patterns I've used a German twisted cast on because I just like the decorative edge, but in this case our cast on edge is this side and this side. These 2 sides are going to be made up by that slip stitch selvage that we do. You know how we slip the first stitch of every row? So I wanted this to look a little more simple, more like that slip stitch on the sides is going to look. So I just used a normal long tail cast on. You're welcome to use whatever cast on you want, but keep in mind that we're not going to be going all the way around the square to finish it off. So you're going to have this edge looking the same as the slip stitch selvage that you have here. Sound good? Let's get started. Once again, we're working with Lion Brand 24/7 cotton yarn, this time in the grass colorway. Now I've gotten us started a little bit here. I cast on 90 stitches. This is the end of my cast on here. So I cast on 45 stitches here, then I placed a stitch marker, and then I cast on another 45 stitches. Now I've started row 1 and I've worked seed stitch, slip the first stitch and then knit 1, purl 1 all the way around for 43 stitches, which brought me to 2 stitches before my marker. See, there's my marker and I've got 2 stitches left. So this is where I'm going to start the decreases. So I start with, I want my decrease to lean this way, and I've written this with a slip slip knit because that's probably the more common decrease that most people use. I don't actually like it. I use a different one that I substitute instead, which is a slip 1, knit 1, Okay, and then pass the slipped stitch over. And that gives you almost the same effect as a slip knit. It's still a decrease that leans to the left. And that's all that really matters. Use any decrease you like as long as it leans to the left. Slip knit is perfectly fine. Now I'm shifting my marker over, and now I want a decrease that leans to the right, which is the knit two together. So we're going to, oh, my stitches are a little tight here, but we're going to knit two together. And there we have our decreases. Okay. Now I ended this one with a purl before the decrease. So I'm going to make it match, I'm going to start the next stitch with a purl also. So it's knit, purl, and then you do these decreases, and you're going to start with a purl. So it'll be purl, knit, all the way to the end. So it is purl, knit, purl, and so on and so forth. I'm going to get to the end of the row and to where I'm starting the next row, and then I will come back to you. Okay, I've finished row 1 and I'm about to start on row 2, but I wanted to show you, you can sort of see the little point forming right here where we did our decreases right around that that stitch marker. So one side is going to be the bottom of your square and one side is going to be the side of your square, and that is the point. So it'll be like that. So let's start on row 2. And row 2 is a wrong side row, so the wrong side rows are actually easier than the right side rows because we're not going to do any decreases at all whatsoever on the wrong side rows. So here we're starting every row the same way with a slip stitch, and that will give us that that nice selvage at the edge, that nice neat looking edge. So we start with a slip stitch and we're just working seed stitch. It's always, because of the stitch count, it's always going to be slip stitch and then knit when you start the row. So that's an easy way to know, which stitch you have to do next. But if you're not sure, look at the stitch we did previously. This is showing as a purl on the wrong side, so we want to knit on top of that purl. So slip, knit, and then it's just seed stitch all the way up to the center. So I will catch up with you when I get there. All right, I'm getting close to the center now. I've got 3 stitches left. This one's a knit, purl, and knit. Now here's the only tricky part, okay? Remember when we went the other way, we mirrored our work on either side of the marker. So I'm going to slip the marker, and the last stitch I did was a knit, so if I was just going in seed stitch, the next one would be a purl. But because I'm mirroring this on either side of the marker, I go knit, marker, and then knit again. And you can see that this is a purl stitch, so I'm knitting over that purl. So knit. And now we continue with seed stitch. So you can see there's a knit stitch on either side, and that's simply just to mirror around that corner. So I continue with seed stitch up to the end, and we'll pick it up at row 3. So row 3 is just the same as row 1, and I've worked up to the last 2 stitches before the marker just like I did on row 1, so I can show you the decreases, because remember, the odd numbered rows are the right side rows, and that's where we're going to do our decreases. So the first decrease, I want it to lean to the left, so I'm going to do either a slip knit or the one I prefer, which is the slip 1 knit 1, and then pass the slip stitch over. Either way, whatever you do, as long as it's a left leaning decrease, slip your marker and then do a knit 2 together for the right leaning decrease. And that is, now you can really see that corner starting to form there where you've got the bottom and you've got the side. And now we're going to continue with our seed stitch. You can see the seed stitch border starting to form here. The seed stitch border is 5 rows wide, and this is row 3. So row 4 is going to be the exact same as row 2, where we're just going to work across without the decreases. And then row 5 is going to be the same as row 1 and row 3. We're still doing seed stitch and we're still doing the decreases on either side of the stitch marker. Where it gets different is row 6, because that's where we start doing the garter stitch section. So I'm going to finish all the way up to row 6, and then I will catch up with you there. I know I said row 4 was going to be exactly like row 2, but I wanted to show you there is actually one slight difference. Every time we do an even numbered row, or sorry, an odd numbered row, or right side row, we're decreasing one stitch on this side and one stitch on this side of the marker. So what that does is we alternate between having an even number of stitches on each side of the marker and an odd number of stitches on each side of the marker, which means that we're going to end in a different place in our seed stitch. So on row 2 we ended with a knit when we got to the marker, but on row 4 we're going to end with a purl. And that's the only real difference. So we end with a purl, we slip the marker, and then remember we're still mirroring it, so we're going to start with a purl again. And continue our seed stitch. And that's really the only difference. Otherwise it's just like row 2 was, but I wanted to show you that because I know I said it was exactly the same and it's not. So I've finished row 6, and as you can see we've got a corner forming here, and we've got 5-row seed stitch border on this side and on this side. If you look at the diagram that we did here, that corresponds to these 5 rows here and these 5 rows here. When we do the next row, we're going to be starting here. We're working on the wrong side. We're going to do a little bit of seed stitch for the edge. Then we're going to do garter stitch all the way down and over, which garter stitch, as you know, is just knitting on each side. And then we're going to do a little bit of seed stitch here. Now, I know I said earlier that we were going to do 5 rows of seed stitch here and 5 rows of seed stitch here, but it's not really rows, is it? Because when we did this, this was 5 rows and this was 5 rows. But we need the equivalent of 5 rows here, but we're doing stitches. This is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches like that. And we know from our previous square that 4 stitches is about the same width as 5 rows is tall. So to make these borders actually match, these ones need to be 4 stitches wide, not 5 rows wide. So we're going to do 4 stitches of seed stitch, then garter stitch, and then 4 stitches of seed stitch. So let's start that. Okay, we start with a slip stitch. And then this is my garter stitch, my seed stitch still. So it's knit, purl, and knit. Okay, so there's my seed stitch, and now I'm going to continue in garter stitch, which is just knitting all the way to the middle. So I'm approaching the middle, and since this is the wrong side row, I'm not going to be doing the decreases. So guess what? I'm just going to keep knitting all the way across. I'll move the marker when I come to it. Oh, there we go. And just keep knitting all the way across until I get to those last 4 stitches to do that seed stitch border at the end there. Okay, I've come to the last 4 stitches, and this is the part that's going to be seed stitch. For seed stitch, I want to make sure that the stitch is the opposite of what's below it. So this is a purl below it, so it's going to be a knit. So knit, purl, knit, purl. So there is my 4-stitch seed stitch border. Now I'm going to flip it over and start the next row, which is a right side row, so we will be doing the decreases, but let's start with the 4-stitch border. And I know these are really long rows right now, but we're decreasing a little bit every time, so they'll get much shorter pretty quickly. So slip 1, knit 1, purl 1, and knit 1. So there's my 4-stitch seed stitch border. Now I'm knitting across to the center because I'm doing garter stitch. I have come to the middle to 2 stitches before the marker, so I'm going to do my left leaning decrease, slip the marker, and do my right leaning decrease. That's giving us that nice mitered edge there. and continuing in garter stitch all the way across to the last 4 stitches. Okay, I'm up to my last 4 stitches, and I'm going to do the seed stitch here. So it's knit, purl, knit, purl. So all the rest of the rows for quite some time are going to continue this way. Let's look at our diagram again. It's going to continue to be seed stitch, garter stitch to the center, garter stitch all the way to the end, and then seed stitch. If we're on the right side, we'll do our decreases when we get to the center, and if we're on the wrong side, we'll just garter stitch right over. So just knit right over that center. And that holds true all the way to the end of the square, and you can see how the rows get smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to this point where there's no more garter stitch left in the middle and we're just doing seed stitch. So I'm going to knit all the way up to this point and then come back and show you how to finish it off. I'm back and the washcloth is nearly finished. You can see the sections we were talking about here is that seed stitch section around the edge. You've got the garter stitch that comes across this way. So you've got the nice angled edge with that miter going across the middle. And now we're right at the end where there's only enough stitches left to do the seed stitch. So we're going to finish up that final corner together. Let me just adjust the camera a little bit. Okay, so if you look, we have 5 stitches on this side of the marker and 5 stitches on this side of the marker. We're on a right side row, and I'm just going to finish up the whole rest of the washcloth for you here. So we start with, basically we're just going to do seed stitch as far as we can and do the decreases when we get to them. So we start with a slip stitch, and then it's knit, purl. Okay, and normally I would knit, but now we're at the 2 stitches before the marker. So I'm just going to go ahead and do my left leaning decrease. And if you remember, we have to mirror this, so we'll do our decrease on this side. And the last stitch that I did before the decrease was a purl right here. So I'm going to do a purl here, and it goes purl, knit, purl. And we're actually at the point where we can remove that marker because we don't really need to see it anymore. We're down to just a few stitches here. So as I come to it this time, I'm going to go ahead and remove it. This is the wrong side row, so we just work across. So it's slip, knit, purl, knit. I've come to the marker, so I'm removing that marker. And we've got to remember now when we come to the middle, we mirror it. So I just did a knit, so knit, purl, knit, purl. And you're going to know that you're doing it right if you end with a purl. Every row ends with a purl. So if you end with a knit, you've made a mistake somewhere. Okay, so now we've got these 2 are going to be decreased and these 2 are going to be decreased. So there's 2 stitches on each side before the decrease. So those 2 stitches are going to be slip and knit. And then we've got to do our decrease. And then we do the other decrease. And the last thing we did before the decreases was a knit, so knit and then purl. Okay, we're getting right down to the end. We're going to work this all the way until there's no stitches left. So we've got now 6 stitches, so we go slip, knit, purl. Okay, that's 3, and then purl, knit, for the other 3. And back to the front. Turning takes longer than the actual knitting, doesn't it, at this point? Everything's big and gets tangled. Okay, so now we've got 3 stitches on each side, so that is just the first stitch and the decrease. So here's the slip, and then the decrease. Oh, wrong decrease. We want a left-leaning decrease here. So slip, and then the decrease, and then our right-leaning decrease. And the last stitch is always a purl. Okay, and on this side we have, now we've got 2 stitches on each side, so it's slip, knit, and then mirror it, so knit and purl. Okay, back to the other side. We've got, now we just have 2, so basically we just have the decrease. So forget about that starting slip stitch. Just do your normal left-leaning decrease, whether that's a slip, slip, knit, or the one I'm doing, and then do your normal right-leaning decrease. And we are down to now 2 stitches on the hook, if I can finish this stitch. I think this yarn is split. Yep, there it is. Let's fix that. Okay. So now the right-leaning decrease. All right, down to 2 stitches on the needle. We're on the wrong side row, so we just knit and purl. Well, slip and purl. Slip the first stitch, and then go ahead and purl the last stitch. Okay, and this will be the last row, and all that's left is 1, so it really doesn't matter which decrease you do. You can do the left leaning, the right leaning. I think the knit 2 together is easiest, so I'm doing a knit 2 together. We're down to our very last stitch. We're going to cut this and pull it through, and then that will be the end of our washcloth. I've got my handy dandy circular cutter here. And just, we want some yarn to weave in, so cut a little bit farther back and pull that through. Let's zoom out a bit and take a look at our finished washcloth. And there you go. We have a finished washcloth. So I hope you enjoyed this pattern, and I will see you next time for another great stitch pattern to learn.